Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Aujourd'hui, je m'apprête à accueillir dans mon petit écran le Dr Rollin McCraty, qui est le cofondateur et le directeur de la recherche à l'Institut HeartMath. Bien entendu, nous allons parler de cohérence cardiaque. Nous allons également parler de l'Institut lui-même, de sa naissance, de son évolution, puisque le Dr McCraty était là depuis les tout débuts, en 1991. Il va surtout nous expliquer pourquoi la vision et la méthode de l'Institut HeartMath dépassent largement le cadre d'une simple pratique de modulation respiratoire. Et donc nous allons aborder des sujets comme la régulation émotionnelle et l'accès à l'intuition. Alors j'espère que tous ces sujets vont vous passionner. En tout cas, moi je vous retrouve juste après pour faire un court résumé comme d'habitude et vous donner des indices si jamais vous souhaitez en savoir plus sur l'Institut HeartMath. Je vous retrouve tout de suite. Bonne interview. Good morning, Dr. Rollin McCraty. I'm really happy to welcome you, and I'm really happy you accepted this interview to talk a little bit about you and about HeartMath to our French community, basically.
I'm happy to be here, Fred, and have a conversation.
You are part of the story of HeartMath, and I would even say you are part of the history of HeartMath. So, in a few words, could you speak a little bit about you and your relationship with HeartMath from the start?
Well, let's see. That could be a long story, probably longer when we want to get into. But let's just say at that time when I met Doc Childrey, the founder of HeartMath, I had already gone through a lot of life experience in a way, and had been a communication engineer, worked for Motorola, decided I was more entrepreneurial spirit. So I had started a couple different successful companies actually. And at that time I was, I had co-founded a company in electrostatics, and we were doing quite well. And I'd also had gotten along my journey a degree in consciousness studies.
All right.
I, knew about meditation and practiced meditation techniques for many years, and looking back on that period pre-HeartMath, I could do a wonderful meditation in the morning, which I did pretty much every day, and zoom around the universe and whip my energy through the chakras and all that stuff. Jump in the car and head off to work and hit the traffic jams, be frustrated and kind of edgy, and then walk in the door and all the employee issues and this and that, and
yes,
be pretty grumpy. And so even though I'd had this wonderful meditation, it didn't really transfer into life. And don't get me wrong, I got a lot of benefit out of meditation practices and things, but there was just still something deeper missing. And then I'd met Doc Childrey through some mutual friends from past experiences and things in spirulina and that kind of thing. But so I was on the East Coast where he was at that time, and figured I'd go meet this character, and that I'd heard through my friends about, and spend an hour, get to know him. I ended up spending 3 days, and I knew about the heart, the idea of the heart being the access to higher intelligence and wisdom and all the stuff through all the other practices. But it was honestly more of a metaphor, and the heart chakra, okay, yeah, like any other chakra, that kind of thing. And that, using that language from that era. And so, but I got introduced to no, that's not what the heart's really about. It's a much deeper part of our beingness, the real heart that we talk about at HeartMath now, that at least we talk about now. Mm-hmm. So this is before there's any techniques, right? HeartMath techniques, or even HeartMath as a name. I had I'll just say a heart awakening experience through that period. And you can't explain experiences. You have to have them. You can never transfer them in a way that's people. So I don't even try. But let's just say it was a big wake up for me. Upon returning, back to life as normal, and I started bringing those concepts and practices into my company. And I can honestly say, Fred, that I made more personal progress and gains in 3 months than I had in many years of meditative practices.
Oh, wow.
And then finally had the courage to follow my own heart, so I basically sold that company and to the employees, so I could do it very quickly for far less than it was actually really worth. And then helped join with Doc and others to help found HeartMath, what became HeartMath. Mm-hmm. And then we spent a few years really just practicing, learning what later became the HeartMath system ourselves, and then decided to start the nonprofit, the HeartMath Institute. That was in 1990. Given my background in research and product development and all the stuff I had done, it suggested that, hey, why don't you start the research center? Because we've got to have research. Otherwise, it's just another conceptual thing out of California. Yes. And the heart is, but Doc's been very clear from the very beginning that, we all have a heart, and that science is for many people, the language that they relate to. Not into spirituality or airy-fairy stuff. They want grounded, real. And then there's a big part of the world that could care less about the science, but a very big chunk that does. So that's why we started that. And it's been a really cool journey, the last 30 years on the science side of things. A lot of unexpected discoveries, and that kind of really changed our direction and led to new unexpected.
It's great to hear about meditation, because I'm giving teachings in a spiritual center, teachings about heart coherence. And when I came there to offer them these teachings, they say, "Hey, we have been waiting for this for years, because it's a scientific validation of what we know for millenniums about the heart, and especially because in this tradition, the location of the mind is within the heart." It's unbelievable how many matches we were able to find in between what HeartMath is telling about the heart and what the traditions, the very old traditions, are telling as well.
Sure.
About the state of coherence, can you describe shortly the state of coherence and also the benefits of it? Because what we see when we go during workshops, when we, for instance, give a technique about paced breathing, most of the people experience some kind of calm, but many people in the beginning, they don't experience anything, because there's a kind of disconnection in between the feeling tone and the exercise.
So yes, but let me address the last part of what you stated, especially when you're first learning and practicing, heart coherence techniques. A lot of people have an expectation that it's going to be like you drank a super-sized cup of coffee, or you're going to have some big experience, and that's not usually the case, or often not the case. I can address that a couple of ways. If you can imagine a car and you're filling up the gas tank, right? The car doesn't necessarily feel anything because you filled up the gas tank, if the car had feelings, but it gets a lot of mileage out of that, a lot of energy. With more practice, I think a lot of people do start connecting with their larger self and having some more significant experiences. But it's let's start with coherence, just the word coherence. And I think most people have an intuitive idea of what coherence is. It's something good, right? If you look it up in the dictionary, the first definition is usually something about, well, hopefully right now, I'm able to put my words together in a way that create a coherent sentence that has meaning. It's not just a bunch of jumbled words. So if I was uttering nonsense, and had too much to drink or something, what do you say? Well, God, that was an incoherent statement, or they're really incoherent. So coherence in science is used for every branch of, pretty much every branch of science there is, from the very small, the molecular level, all the way to the universe. So coherence is really how we would mathematically or conceptually describe complex systems, and how well are the parts of a system working together in harmony to create a wholeness or an output that's greater than the sum of the parts in an energy efficient way. So it's really things working together well or optimally. Now, so in our research, we look in really three main pillars, I would say, or spheres. So personal coherence. How well are the systems within our body, our immune system, hormonal system, the different branches of the nervous system, the brain, different areas of the brain, the heart and brain, all of these subsystems really to give us our wholeness, or to be awake, conscious beings working together or not, right? And when they're working together harmoniously and coherently, that's a very energy efficient state. So even though you like you said, you get coherent, you may not feel like, Superman or something, but there's a lot going on in that coherent state physiologically that underlies our capacity to think clearly, to make better decisions, faster reaction times, all these things that we can measure. So there are over 500 independent studies now, not done, another independent, not done by us, right? That have used coherence training in about every context you can think of, health improvement, academic performance in students, better, especially, and I know you had mentioned that were a pilot, so we do a lot of work in law enforcement and first responders. And in fact, I'm honored to say that you might know this, I don't know, Fred, we developed the resilience program for the U.S. Navy in their highest stress mission. So how do we teach especially young men and women in these very high stress conditions without a lot of life experience, oftentimes in self-regulation, but how do we give them tools and techniques to be able to maintain their composure, right, and make good decisions in the chaos that they find themselves in the outer world. So that's really what coherence is about. It's about being able to really maintain our composure. That'd be one important aspect. Or if you're an athlete, how do we get the systems in sync to perform better? I actually know of several world records that have been set after the athletes went through coherence training in the Olympic side. So there's a lot going on inside our body that you don't necessarily feel or have conscious perception of, but they do play out in life experience, yes. Especially once we do some practice with it. So how do we measure it? Is that part of what you're asking, or how do we train it?
Yeah, the measurement is definitely central because it gives a direct feedback to the people. So they are really interested when they see it on the screen, because maybe in the beginning they don't feel it, but if they see it, at least they can start believing it.
Yeah, let me go back. You asked about history a little bit too, so let me kind of weave some things together. So I'm going to dial back 30 years now, or time travel back 30 years ago, when we were first starting the HeartMath Research Center. And I had an engineering background and a lot of development of stuff under my history, but learning about physiological stuff was new. So I had to go through a lot of learning in those early years. Mike Atkinson, lab manager, and myself, who really started it all. This is before we had digital data acquisition systems, and this is 30 years ago. So we started with an insight into looking at positive emotions and on how that affect physiology, our body, our rhythms and functions in the body. So we were measuring brain waves and skin conductance, and of course the electrocardiogram and other types of measures, blood pressure, and in those early years, hormonal flows and a bunch of stuff. We had to learn how to do all that. At that time, this is interesting too, I think. I don't talk about this a lot, but we didn't have internet back then either, right? Or so you had to go to the library to find research papers and do
I remember
research. Remember back then, you actually had to do, research and get journals off the shelf and photocopy paper. Well, there were maybe 3 papers published in peer-reviewed scientific journals, the thing that scientists seem to care about, on the effects of positive emotions on function, body function, or health. Very, very little. There were thousands on stress and depression and these types of things. Just to kind of keep in mind, hardly anybody was really interested in what happens when we actually have the experience or feeling things like appreciation or compassion or love, these types of things. There was very little on that at that time. But through some of the practices we'd already been doing, we kind of knew that things like appreciation, these types of emotions, had a lot of benefits in life anyway. So we started, of course, we've looked at things like frustration or anger and stuff to have comparisons. But we were among the first to really take a deeper look at what happens physiologically, with our brain waves and heart and these different functions, skin conductance and so on, blood pressure, and all this stuff. And what we found was that the most reflective measure of emotions in general, but especially positive emotions, was the heart, and in particular, the rhythm of the heart. What's now called heart rate variability, pretty popular term. A lot of people have heard of HRV, or heart rate variability now. It's kind of crossed over into the public with lots of apps and things. But at that time, nobody ever heard of it. What we were finding was that this took some time to get onto, but looking at the beat-to-beat change in heart rate and the patterns that the heart rhythm produces, was the most reflective of emotions in general. And, we could actually distinguish different types of emotions through that, way more than brain waves, and these types of things. So we reached out to some other scientists and we were learning in learning mode. And I was really fortunate. I've had a lot of really awesome mentors that our early work drew to us. Pretty famous people that got intrigued by what we were doing and kind of the novelty of it and a fresh approach. And one of them was a guy named Carl Pribram, Dr. Carl Pribram. And the younger people listening probably would never heard of him, but he's a very, very famous neuroscientist and is considered by many to be the father of modern cognitive neuroscience, in fact. A lot of credits to his name. He's the guy who coined the term executive function to describe the frontal part of our brain. Was head of research at Stanford University, brain research, for his whole career. And then after he retired, he opened another lab. And it's just actually one of the first brain surgeons that ever existed. He really came from knowing nothing about the brain to being one of the world's expert. And one of the things Dr. Pribram said is, many groups, research groups, have spent their careers trying to find the physiological correlations to emotion states using brain waves and EEG and so on. And what you've already done using the heart is already far past what they ever achieved. So stick with that. It's kind of what he was saying, is you're on the right track here. What was really unique was what we found, that the people who could really drop into the heart, I'll call it, and, just to sit there and have and feel things like appreciation or compassion, or really any of those regenerative emotions, or what we would now call heartfelt, higher emotions. Not only their heart rhythm pattern shifted into a dramatically different pattern. It wasn't subtle. It was a state shift. That's why we call it heart coherent state. And which is now called coherence or heart coherence or cardiac, a lot of different names around it: cardiac coherence, heart coherence, physiological coherence. In fact, my scientific advisory board, which was made up of some pretty heavyweights at that time, we spent about 2 years in our advisory board meetings deciding what to call this unique state. And of course, coherence ended up being later the term. So we conducted a number of studies back then where we consciously didn't tell people to change their breathing. In fact, we learned pretty quickly that if you don't want people to focus on breathing, don't mention it at all. You don't want to say, don't change your breathing, because then people change their breathing and can't help it. So we didn't even mention it. We just put the focus on really, really experience, that heartfelt feeling of appreciation or compassion or love, these types of feelings. In fact, they shifted into this state. Now, it doesn't mean that when you shift into, it's fairly well known that breathing also changes when you change emotional states. We can actually use breathing rates to kind of get a sense of what somebody's feeling. Not nearly as deeply or as good as looking at the heart rhythms, but they are related.
Yes, yes, definitely.
So many years later, in that, once we started to really see what this state was, identify it, and start to understand what that meant in terms of what's going on in the body and the benefits of that. And there are a lot, physiologically speaking. Then we started developing techniques that allow people to quickly shift from a normal or incoherent state, if you're frustrated or impatient, into coherence, right? And then correlated that in different studies with shifts in hormones and immune function and these types of things. And then did a series of more clinically focused work. How does it help people lower their blood pressure or improve their hormonal balance or their immune function, these types of things. This is back in the 90s. Before we shifted in our focus more into the social side of things. How do we get along better with others and these types of studies, and then more the global work. So I kind of long-winded, I'm sorry, but the 3 spheres to circle back were personal coherence, social coherence or relational coherence. How do we create more coherence and productivity, right, in teams, or whether that's a family or a work team, leadership team, nursing team, a military unit, because coherence, same thing. What's the harmony in the relationships and the output of a group or a team? And then more recently, the global coherence type measures and things. So I know that's a very long-winded
It's important because definitely you mentioned emotions. The story on this part of the ocean is, HeartMath started to get known at the end of the 90s, I think. And I think the first doctor who spoke about it is Dr. David Servan-Schreiber, the Frenchman.
Oh, I remember that name from way back when. Now, was he a nutritionist?
He was a brain surgeon as well, I think. But he passed away start of the 2000s, and he was the first to mention HeartMath in his books. He wrote 2 books about it was anti-cancer and another one, which is healing from depression. And there was in each of his books there were 2 chapters completely dedicated about HeartMath.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But when he passed away, it was taken over by other trainers, and in the beginning, they started to mention paced breathing only because they thought Europeans are really rational, so emotions won't be too popular. And when I started about heart Cohérence, was the same thing. So resonant breathing, it was really popular for the young student pilots as well, and we did it. But then what happened to me? One day I went to school, waiting for my kid, and I started to plug to my iPhone to make an exercise, but I forgot about it. It was springtime, birds were singing, and I heard the kids playing in the courtyard. And when I look back at it, I entered spontaneously into a high rate of coherence. I was not even breathing. Mm-hmm. So I say, that's it. So now I started to believe in the system. And then I decided to switch over to HeartMath and follow that path. So I'm really happy I did.
So let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Now, breathing does modulate the heart rhythm.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's just basic physiology. And in fact, we can look at the HRV, the beat-to-beat change in heart rate, and tell exactly how deep they're breathing and at what frequency they're breathing at. So it would be incorrect to try and say that breathing isn't part of the story. It is, and it's an important part of the story. Mm-hmm. So going back to those early studies when I talked about this kind of magical state, that we were finding that people naturally shift into without necessarily shifting, even thinking about breathing, just like your experience. But that doesn't mean that your breathing didn't change. Mm-hmm. Right? It actually did. So breathing is a physiological function that we have conscious interaction with, right? I can choose to breathe slower and deeper. Right?
Yes.
Consciously. That's not true for most of the autonomic functions that we have in the body. But most of the time, let's face it, we're not walking around thinking about breathing or changing our breathing. 99.9% of our lives, we're not thinking about that. But there is a relationship between heart rate variability, and breathing, and also blood pressure rhythms. Now, here's one of the things that's true when you're in this coherent state, where you see the nice sine wave patterns in the heart rhythm, is that however you get there, whether it's through breathing at the right rhythm or you're just feeling good, right? The breathing rhythms, the heart rate variability of the heart rhythms, and our beat-to-beat blood pressure rhythms actually synchronize and entrain to the same frequency. And this is one aspect of why it's a very efficient state. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a school out there that's called resonant frequency breathing. You kind of already mentioned that, where you find somebody, the frequency they breathe at that maximizes the rhythm. So you are entraining those same rhythms.
Yes.
When you do that. But that's not the approach we took early on. We discovered this early on. We were one of the first to actually discover this. And, 6 breaths per minute breathing, all that. That wasn't very big. Nobody really heard of that. It was so much of that's based on our early research, by the way. It's amazing how it kind of spread in different schools and thoughts. And nobody was onto that I know of, and except maybe some of the yogic, but they didn't understand necessarily the physiology of what we were describing. Okay, so you can breathe yourself into coherence. You most certainly can. But if you're just doing paced breathing, you're still stuck in the head. Most of the HeartMath techniques start with heart-focused breathing. That's the first step. Put your focus of attention here, the center of your chest, and breathe slower and deeper than normally, around 4 or 5 seconds on the in breath, 4 or 5 seconds on the out breath. If we're wanting to shift into coherence quickly and in the middle of a stress situation, why not use breath to facilitate the process?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Nothing wrong with that. You don't have to do that with some training and practice. People, in fact, that's one of the things when we retrain our brain and nervous system, we don't have to rely on the breathing so much to get into coherence. But in the beginning, yes. If you take ordinary people who don't have experience with meditation or breathing practices, and have them pace their breathing at this optimal rhythm, about half the population are going to find it very uncomfortable after about a minute. And they don't want to do it again. Okay, through just breathing.
Yeah,
right?
True. Yeah.
And I understand why now. I mean, that was also through, I learned all the real mechanisms of how this stuff works from Dr. Pribram early on. But now if you take those same people and have them, but pace their breathing maybe for a few breath cycles. Say, now forget about all this, focused on your pacing the breathing, but kind of keep that rhythm that you've got familiar with breathing. But now try and activate a feeling of appreciation, right? Or it doesn't have to be appreciation, but we start with appreciation because from the majority of people in the world, that's a feeling, a renewing feeling they can access. And it doesn't have a lot of baggage associated with it, like some others do. Like I can appreciate that I have a home to go home to, or someone in my life that cares about me, or it's a nice day out. It doesn't matter what, right? Or that feeling you have when your pet greets you.
Yes.
What happens is that takes the coherence to a much deeper, more stable frequency or level. And you get people out of the head, out of the mind, so that you don't have that uncomfortability, so they can maintain coherence for much longer periods without it becoming uncomfortable. But in reality, you're going to a much deeper state of what I call energetic coherence. That's past just breathing yourself into a physiological state of coherence. They're very different states. In fact, in the early years, we coined different terms to describe those two different states of breathing yourself into coherence, physiological coherence, what the term I use scientifically, or psychophysiological coherence, for when we're adding that emotional shift, right? And now you're starting to shift hormones and things that you don't just through breathing in our body. So there's nothing wrong with breathing as long as you don't get stuck in the head. So I'm not a personal fan of the resonant frequency breathing approach, where you find this rhythm and forever you're gonna follow the little ball and pace people at that rhythm, and that's what you do, and that's all you do.
Yes.
Now there's obviously benefits from that, a lot of benefits,
Yeah.
but nowhere near what happens when you make this deeper shift into what we really mean by coherence. Well, two things I want to mention here. Given my engineering background in communications and magnetic fields, and I was professional, right, at this. I won't tell you the true story of how we got to this, but when we put electrodes on the body to measure the electrocardiogram, or on your head to measure the electroencephalogram, in both cases, we have those labels because what we're measuring is current flow, electrical energy, the flow of electrical current. That's what electrodes do, right? These amplifiers that figure those currents. So we know in physics 101, you learn this probably in grade school these days. Whenever there's a flow of electrical current, you create a magnetic field, right? So electrodes don't see that. You need a different instrument called a magnetometer. But one of the qualities of magnetic fields is they go through things. That's why cell phones work indoors, right? Literally, it's the magnetic component, and electric and magnetic fields are very different things. We call it electromagnetism because one makes the other, but so it's the magnetic component that goes through the walls and the windows and so on to carry the information to the cell tower, your voice or your text message, whatever. Well, it's the same thing in us, right? So we are literally broadcasting these magnetic fields. And long story short, what we were able to show, this is all back in the 90s still, is that those fields are carrying emotional state information, right? I mean, we are literally broadcasting it. And I mean, this shouldn't be news to anybody that's watching this, because we know this. It's in our language, right? The tension was so thick in that room, you could have cut it with a knife, right? These sayings we have, and in the 60s, people talked about good vibes or bad vibes, and they had it right, actually. And that kind of language is coming back.
Yeah.
Then we were able to show that our nervous systems are big antennas, if you will, that are exquisitely tuned to other biologically generated rhythms and frequencies. There's windows that they respond to. That's another story. So that we know there's this energetic communication system going on between people now, usually at an and until you get more self-aware, it's at an unconscious level. So if we just breathe ourselves into coherence, you're not necessarily changing in the same way that emotional information being carried by the field. Whereas if we make that emotional shift, so others start to feel. I mean, this applies to about every. Once you think about it and you understand this, there isn't probably anything in any job in the world that this isn't relative to. If you're having a meeting or a meeting with a client, or you're a police officer interacting with a citizen, they're detecting this information. You get where I'm trying to go with that? So just breathing yourself in, it doesn't have that same.
No.
You're not changing that information. Yeah. Because that's one, we could spend the whole thing talking about this, but that was one. And the other thing I wanted to mention here that I think is relevant is one of the things that you asked the difference between just breathing yourself into coherence and really making the shift, right? Is intuition. Okay. So one of the things that we heard and still hear to this day from people who learn the practices of coherence, however you get there. HeartMath is just a straight line, quick way to shift into coherence, that their intuition, even though they may not feel anything while they're in coherence in the beginning, but they do start experiencing, most people, is that their intuition has radically changed, improved. And then usually the second thing they talk about is synchronicities. Have become, for me, I'll be honest, they're a way of life. I expect them. And I just had a couple yesterday that were like, wow, this is awesome. So what we then did was we spent a couple of years looking at the original studies. I titled them the electrophysiology of intuition. And long story short, what we found is that these are experimental, very rigorous lab-based studies to show that there is a kind of a scanning of the future, if you will, by our physiology that keeps us out of trouble a lot of times. I'm sure as a pilot, you know what I'm talking about. This is very real, and I hear this all the time, especially from first responders, military, law enforcement. They're very aware of this. Yes. But we were able to show it in the lab. And I won't go into all the detail here, but this even surprised me and our staff. But what we found, and this has been replicated many times now outside of our lab as well, is that the heart is the first system to get the information about the future. The heart sends a measurably different signal to the brain. Right? You can measure that change in the neural information being sent to the brain. Then you get a brain response and a body response. So the gut gets the credit, the gut feeling of the hair on the back of the neck, but it's really heart, brain, body, and if we're paying attention. And how we got this published back in that era, this is late, somewhere in the 90s, forget now the exact years, but we published a number of papers on this, but I said the heart has access to a field of information outside the boundaries of time and space, right? So how do mothers know their children are in harm's way when they're on the other side of town or the other side of the planet, right? I don't want to get too deep here into mechanisms, but
no. But can you just confirm that what you said is really important, but that the heart has access to some kind of information up to 5 seconds before
but 20 becomes aware of it. 20 seconds. I mean, the 5 seconds you're referring to is the first experiment. And that's just an artifact of the experimental protocol. right? If you only have a 5-minute window or 6-minute window, a 6-second window, it's 5 seconds. If you make that window 20 seconds, it's 19 seconds. I mean, then there's so many examples of this. But the point, Fred, I wanted to make here is why you can breathe yourself into coherence. You're not opening that channel between the heart and brain, which we were able to scientifically measure. So a lot of our brain waves, just walking around now, for most people who are listening to this, around 12% of their neural brainwave activity, and this is true of all brain waves, alpha, theta, beta, all the different rhythms, are synchronized to the heart. This is a measurable heart-brain synchronization. So when we get into a coherent heart state, that the synchronized activity between heart and brain is significantly increased. And that's what that underlies performance. It's not necessarily that you have more of a certain brainwave, like more alpha. A lot of people know about alpha. You mean what? You make more alpha? Great. Close your eyes. You want to make even more? Put earplugs in. Because alpha is just the resonant frequency of an idle brain, basically. What we found is that when people are coherent, heart coherent, prior to these experiments with the intuition experiments, that channel, that information between the heart and brain right to the frontal cortex is significantly changed, significantly opened, might be a word I could use here that would be accurate. So the reason I wanted to share this is the basis of my favorite technique called freeze frame, which is a technique that allows us to access that deeper intuitive information. And it is so important in today's world of how we navigate, all the changes and everything that's going on, where we're able to access that deeper intuitive information, which I would suggest really comes from we here at HeartMath, we call it our larger self. You can call it your higher self. I avoid those kind of terms. I'm talking in the science of the language of science here, not religion or spirituality. I'm just saying this is real. We've proven this time and time again. So I use this all the time. I'm stuck on a writing project. I'll stop and ask my heart, my deeper intuition, what's a better way to go here. But with practice, this is something that you can bring right into daily life, right in the moment. So you're not going to get that through just breathing yourself into coherence. No. There's steps to the technique.
Completely true. I did the exercise with someone which was quite rational, and they said, told me about breathing and not about emotions. But yeah, let's try that freeze frame, because the woman was in a burnout. And on the first attempt, she had access to a kind of information. And what's important to mention, for me, this information looked obvious, but she was so deeply stuck in our thinking pattern that she just side shifted a little bit due to the freeze frame, and she came to another solution right spontaneously. And that's important, because people say, oh, no, that intuition and freeze frame thing is like science fiction. Not at all. Just to open that window, as you said, and see other possibilities which you were not able to see because you were stuck in the head in your rational patterns. I'm happy you mentioned the brainwaves, because that leads me to my next question. Many people who would like to incorporate heart coherence in meditation. You mentioned that there is a synchronization when you're in coherence in between mid-alpha range around the 10 hertz. Then people are thinking about, well, alpha is ideal for meditation. What would be your story about it?
Well, okay. So, yes, I mean, I kind of already talked a little bit about that. When we get into a heart coherent state, there is increased synchronization, heart-brain synchronization. And so alpha is the easiest one. You can actually even see it right in the time domain signals. If you actually plot brain waves and the heartbeat together in the same timeline, you can actually see you'll see when an alpha burst or an alpha rhythm starts is almost, well, not almost always, but often in sync with the heartbeat. So it's actually the heartbeat that creates, there's a whole sub-science on this that creates the brain waves. I mean, it's the pulsing rhythm that they synchronize to. So alpha, but this is true for all brain waves. When we get coherent, we're increasing the synchronization. In my field, psychophysiology, brain waves aren't such a big deal. And yes, if you're anxious or stressed or have a lot of mental processing going on, that will reduce alpha, because we call it alpha desync in the profession here. which shows that in an area of the brain that's processing information, alpha goes away because you're starting to use those neural structures to process information. So when the brain is idle, like I said, if you want to make more alpha, close your eyes, plug your ears, so you're not using those circuits, you have more alpha. Well, this is well known. I'm not saying anything new here to people. So if you've got a lot, like I said, of anxiety, test anxiety, this or that, trying to increase alpha, this could be a good thing, right? Because you're stopping that mental churning and processing. But if you want to perform better outside of that context, think of a coach, a football coach or basketball, or I'm not sure what all the sports are in France, but I guarantee you most coaches aren't getting the team together saying, okay, now let's relax. Let's get our alpha up high before we hit the field. In that context, that decreases performance. It really does. I mean, this is nothing new here. So I think there's we have to be somewhat careful here about rounding things off. So the big game is increasing the synchronization. Now, let me give you a context here for this. Fundamentally, the brain has to be able to synchronize its own electrical activity, to even be awake and conscious. In fact, in head injuries where you have whiplash or something and people go into a coma, what actually happens, there's these neural loops or circuits between a very core part of the brain called the thalamus and these other all far regions. And this is the thalamus has a lot of jobs and roles, but one of is what it's the synchronizing source globally for the entire brain to synchronize its own electrical activity, all the brain rhythms across them, right? A lot of people know now because of our work, but I didn't invent this. This has been known since the late 1800s, that the heart sends far more information up through the nervous system to the brain than the brain sends to the heart. Those they're called afferent or ascending neural signals, go to every major brain center. And there's a very direct neural pathway from the heart, cardiovascular afferents, comes to the brainstem and then directly to the thalamus. And so depending upon the pattern, I'm going to say here in this context, of those signals, it either inhibits or facilitates the thalamus's ability to synchronize global electrical activity. Now, these were terms that were introduced long before I came along to describe these effects in the 1970s. It's called cortical inhibition or cortical facilitation, right?
Yes.
That's based on this. We now know it took a bunch of years to sort out all the mechanisms, but it's pretty simple at the end of the day. When we're in an incoherent state and the heart rhythms are all jagged and chaotic, right? Usually because we're feeling frustration or impatience or anger or, hate, God, in today's world, that creates that scrambled or incoherent signal that goes to the thalamus, and it's causing a global desynchronization. That's why when we're frustrated or impatient, we have slower reaction times. Our coordination's not as good. And it's why all these areas of the frontal part of the brain, prefrontal cortex, are taking more offline. And what that part of the brain gives us is foresight, right? The ability to understand how our actions and behaviors in this moment are going to affect the future. Not a good idea to hit the boss if you want to keep your job. So foresight's a big umbrella. Planning, goal setting, discrimination of appropriate behavior, abstract thinking are all part of those frontal cortex or executive functions, as Dr. Pribram called them. So that the neural structures or machinery, right, if I can use that word, have to be well synchronized to perform optimally, right? So this is kind of the physiology of why when we get emotionally upset, we get mad at someone or frustrated, that we tend to say and do the things that we later regret. Cortical inhibition. Whereas when we get coherent, into that coherent rhythm, that's also going to the thalamus, and it facilitates global neural synchronization. Now, we may not feel that, like you said, but it sure shows up in our decision-making or capacity to be well self-regulated. Hope I'm making sense here.
Yes, definitely.
But the point I'm trying to make is that synchronization is far more important than how much alpha rhythm I have.
Yes.
Right. See, I can be in heart coherence right now. I don't know if I am or not, but probably. and have low alpha because we're having a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm still more in sync, heart-brain synchronization.
Mm-hmm.
Or I could be getting ready to meditate, or just not driving, not thinking about anything, and have much higher alpha. But it's still the synchronization is what's increased, is the key here. I hope so it's really
that makes a lot of sense.
So the amount of alpha or theta or beta, these different brainwaves, are all context dependent.
Hmm.
Right? So I can be in fact, one of the things we teach in HeartMath, as you would know, is to get coherent before a meeting or driving, or while you're doing these things, so that we can have low alpha and high beta and all this stuff going on, but still be more synchronized, more engaged, hearing deeper, making better choices, and right in that intense meeting maybe. Or I can be getting ready to meditate, right? Very different context and very different brainwave frequencies, but we still want to be in sync. Mm-hmm. So I hope I'm not.
That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. Definitely. Last question, because I know you're starting your day, I'm ending mine, so I will leave you some time to make your work afterwards. Last question, if you don't mind, is about co-regulation. People want to know how far does it work, how long, and does the antenna, obviously ourselves, need to be coherent? Can we entrain other person's heart or other person's brain into it?
Well, I'll tell a little bit of the story. We were doing some work with another one of my mentors, another really famous guy, Dr. William Tiller, who was head of material science at Stanford University. And then he retired, and he spent about 3 years here working out of our lab, and is a world expert in crystallization and water structure, these kind of things, written many books, and, head of material science at Stanford. So we were doing some experiments with water. We kind of discovered that water acted as would amplify small magnetic fields. It was it was a big amplifier of these fields. And Dr. Tiller said, no, this can't happen. And here, come look at the experiment. Then he spent months creating the mathematical model and formula and figured out how it could do that. It totally changed his worldview. I think a lot of people's worldview at that time. So we got the idea then, well, gee, what if we stick one, with all this experimental setup we had at that time, why don't we put an electrode in a glass of water and see if we can measure a heartbeat in it? That's how this all got started. It was kind of backwards in a way. And sure enough, we could. You could have a glass of water sitting on a counter in front of you without touching it, and measure a heartbeat in it. So that field was interacting with the glass of water with the electrode in it, and you can measure a person's heartbeat, that field. So, wow, that's pretty cool. Right? So then it was, I'm giving you the real story of how it really happened. It was kind of backwards, because then, well, gee, we're big bags of water, right? Are we communicating between each other? And that was really quite easy to do, to show that. Now, the reason I'm telling you this background is this is where I made a prediction and I was wrong. So we were doing experiments, now we're wiring up two people, right, to see if we can look at this energetic interaction between them. This is the very beginning of that kind of research. So I predicted, okay, I'm going to get in the coherent, it wasn't me as the subject, but let's say that if I'm the coherent one, I'm radiating these measurably more coherent fields into the environment. I'm the all-powerful one. People are going to synchronize to me, right? I was completely wrong. That's not what happened. When these experiments with pairs of people, the one who was more coherent, what was actually happening was that was increasing their energetic sensitivity. So they would their brain waves would synchronize to the hearts of other people. So we had opened up that communication channel. Now, being they're coherent, they're also more stable, so they're not being knocked off their center or influenced by, say, negative vibrations, which they literally are, vibratory frequencies. So in that coherent state, we're more centered, more stable, which opens up that level of energetic sensitivity to really have access to that. And I call this is a different type of intuition. I call it energetic sensitivity than the other type. So empathy, these kinds of things are through this channel. That doesn't mean, though, that within another set of experiments have been performed, this has been also replicated, that when we are in a coherent state, that does create a more coherent field environment that can help lift others into a more coherent state. So there's a lot going on when we're in this coherent state. I mean, inner synchronization, we're more connected with our own larger intuition from who we really are. We're now creating a field environment that does help others. And in the global work, which we probably don't have time to get to today, suggests that we're also coupled to the larger field as the Earth. And that's, in fact, there's a whole study proving what I was about to say, but we'll save that maybe for another time.
Global Coherence Initiative is something we try to introduce. Still, the problem we have is that all this material is not always available in French, but at least when you see the Global Coherence app is something you can use at individual level as well. So it's great information for the future as well.
So I'm sorry if I rambled on there. I hope this is
no problem. I would be able to make it clear that everybody could follow, and it's really interesting, and I'm really happy you could answer all these questions. It's important for people to get it from the source, because I can tell them, but I'm not a scientific man. But it comes from you now, so that's unbelievably important for us. So I would like to thank you for your time, because we took more than 1 hour of your time and all your answers, and we really appreciate. So
my pleasure. Anything I can do to help.
So I would like to thank you very much, Dr. McCraty. I hope you can give us many interesting research and items in the future to keep the method going. And at my side, we try to develop it in France as much as we can, and I think it's going to be good.
Awesome. All right. We have a great day. Or
Same
again,
to you.
good evening for you.
Well, mine is done. So for you, it's a starting day. So a lot of gratitude for you.
All right. Well, take care.
Bye.
Voilà, j'espère que cette interview vous a plu. Je pense que ce fut intéressant de parcourir l'histoire de l'Institut HeartMath en compagnie d'un membre cofondateur, d'un éminent témoin, un témoin privilégié, le Dr McCraty. Pour résumer un peu ce qu'il nous a dit, j'aimerais dégager 3 éléments. Le premier, c'est l'induction à la cohérence cardiaque. Certes, et il ne faut pas l'oublier, la respiration est un élément essentiel pour l'induction physiologique à l'état de cohérence cardiaque, mais il a bien insisté qu'il était important d'avoir la faculté de se connecter aux qualités intrinsèques du cœur, c'est-à-dire de pouvoir activer des émotions telles que, par exemple, l'appréciation, la sollicitude ou la gratitude. Cela va nous permettre de ne pas rester dans la tête, c'est ça qui est important. Oui, nous pouvons faire de la cohérence cardiaque en regardant un écran et en suivant une petite boule, un guide respiratoire qui va nous permettre d'induire physiologiquement l'état de cohérence, et nous allons en récupérer les effets. Mais ce qui est important, c'est d'entamer cet effet de transformation, ce voyage dont certains maîtres disent que c'est le voyage le plus long et le plus difficile à accomplir, entre la tête et le cœur. Dans un second temps, cette route que nous allons ouvrir, défricher entre la tête et le cœur va nous permettre d'avoir accès à des informations de l'ordre de l'intuition. C'est-à-dire que nous allons avoir accès à des informations qui échappent au domaine spatio-temporel, qui vont nous permettre de développer ce que certains pourraient appeler un 6e sens, ou développer notre clairvoyance. Alors ceci n'est pas de la science-fiction, c'est de la science qui a été soutenue par des recherches, entre autres par l'Institut HeartMath. Dans un 3e temps, est aussi important, et je me suis fait un peu l'avocat du diable pour demander quelle était la relation entre un signal cohérent du cœur et les ondes cérébrales, pour voir si ça pouvait nous permettre d'induire un état méditatif. Il a dit que ce qui est important, c'est en effet synchronisation tête-cœur, et que le fait d'être en cohérence cardiaque va entraîner la majorité de la gamme d'ondes cérébrales. Et pour terminer, il nous a aussi dit qu'il était intéressant, en étant en cohérence, d'avoir accès à ce que les autres encodent dans le champ électromagnétique de leur cœur, c'est-à-dire que nous allons avoir accès à toutes ces informations intuitives et émotionnelles. Voilà. Si tout cela vous intéresse, je mets juste après cette vidéo toutes les informations dont vous avez besoin pour accéder à notre site, voir ce que nous proposons en termes de formation et de matériel de biofeedback. Alors, ma vision, c'est que le matériel de biofeedback est utile, au début en tout cas, pour avoir un retour d'information en temps réel de notre capacité à entrer en cohérence cardiaque. Mais après un certain temps, ce qui est important, c'est de réaliser que le meilleur biofeedback, c'est le biofeedback du cœur. Donc il faut développer cette capacité à ressentir dans le corps et dans le cœur notre capacité à entrer en cohérence cardiaque de manière naturelle et de manière spontanée. Je vous glisse ceci juste après. Moi, je vous dis à tout bientôt pour une prochaine interview, en espérant que cela continue à vous intéresser. À bientôt, bye bye.